Greetings, girl, and welcome to my world of phrasing right up to bat. It's the daisy age, and you're about to walk top stage, so wipe your lottos on the mat. Hip hop love, this is, and don't mind when I.
So you have to understand what's happening in America at this time. In the South, African Americans are moving from the South to the North Midwest, called the Great Migration. Because they're doing that, not saying that things are rosy in the North and the Midwest, but there's Democrats, of course, in those states. And so as African Americans kind of move into those particular states, unlike the South, those Democrats are saying, we actually will compete for your vote. Once again, we know it's all relative. It's not like today. I get that. We all get that. But it's not like the South either. We'll compete for your vote. So when Robert Vann says, turn the picture of Lincoln around, when others say, hey, that debt that has been paid, or we ought to move on, they're talking about moving on to the Democratic Party. But what would make them do that? You know, today, former President Trump says, African Americans ought to just take a chance. What you got to lose by joining the Republican Party? You may say, well, maybe this is what these guys were doing. Maybe they were just taking a chance. What do they have to lose? It's the 1930s. But see, you have to understand what's going on in those northern Midwest states. For instance, you have to realize that Arthur Miller, in the 1930s, African American, would become the first Democrat elected to Congress, 1935. First Democrat elected to Congress as a Democrat. So what you see is now, when I talked about them competing for African American votes, now you have a Democrat elected to Congress, African American. Also, same year, Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania, led by a Democratic governor, they passed their first Civil Rights Act, basically kind of mirroring, to some extent, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So when Robert Vann and W. Du Bois and others are saying, hey, we should move on, they're not just saying, take a chance, what we got to lose. They're seeing the Democrats are competing, and we get it's relative. We understand things weren't rosy. We understand things were not great, but they're competing. They're actually putting people in office, and they're actually passing laws that benefit African Americans. And one of the things, as we kind of talk about this, Frederick Douglass had coined a term when he was around that said the Republican Party was the ship and everything else was the sea. And that's when, we had the Republicans that freed the slaves. What recalls a newspaper article, a newspaper man, African American, to kind of flip that term on its head. And during the 1930s say, if the Republican Party is the ship, after what Hoover had done with John Parker, if the Republican Party is the ship, we better take the sea. So as you see, African Americans are already moving away from the Republican Party. So Roosevelt takes over. He becomes president. And what does he do? So Roosevelt, number one, does a few things. Of course, they have the New Deal. And we realized the New Deal had severe problems because the states could control it. And it had severe problems, especially in the South. African Americans couldn't participate in the New Deal at all. But what you find in the northern states, African Americans are like, okay, it's not the best deal, but it is a deal. It's something. And it's coming from a Democrat. It gives them some hope that they now can start participating in government services. At least the hope was there that they could do that. Another thing that he did was he appointed a guy named Harold Ickes. He appointed him to investigate discrimination in federal offices. That's a big deal. Now, of course, there should be no discrimination in federal offices. Once again, it's relative to the time. But he appoints him to make sure that there's no discrimination in federal offices. And then what else does he do? He appoints William Hastie to be on the federal bench, African American. First African American to be on the federal bench. He does that. He appoints over 40 African Americans to federal offices. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, she resigns from the Daughters of American Revolution because they refused to allow Miriam Anderson to sing in Constitutional Hall. So contrast that with what the Republicans have been doing. Republicans sell out 1877 with the Compromise of 1877. Two Republican presidents basically say, even though you have soldiers, African American soldiers, we don't want to deal with y'all. One group basically being wrongfully accused of murder and also sexual assault. Another group basically trying to get human rights, protesting segregated cars. Two Republican presidents said, get away. Then you have another Republican president who's trying to create some kind of grand bargain with white racists in the South. And then he doubles down and tries to appoint John Parker to the Supreme Court. But what's the Democrats doing? Electing African Americans to Congress. They're actually now trying to investigate to make sure there's no discrimination on federal offices. The president is actually now appointing African Americans to federal jobs. His wife is resigning from positions that doesn't allow Miriam Anderson to sing in front of her particular group. Totally different. So you see, this was not about taking a chance and what do you have to lose. This was real. You could contrast the two parties, and it didn't just start all of a sudden in 1964. So now we go to President Truman, Democrat. first president to speak to an African-American group, the NAACP. And in that speech, he says that the government should protect all of its citizens. And when he says all of its citizens, he means all of its citizens. He desegregated the military. He used an executive order to create a committee on government contract compliance, basically to make sure when the government was contracting with outside vendors, they would not discriminate against those outside vendors, give African Americans possibly a chance. And once again, I get it. It's relative to the time. Not saying everything's peachy and cream, but it's not lily whiteism, and it's not trying to appoint John Parker to the Supreme Court. One of the things he also does is he makes sure that D.C. pools, the District of Columbia pools, remains desegregated. So you see the contrast that's going on. So African Americans now are trending even more towards the Democratic Party, and it's based on real things, real events that's taking place. Then you have Eisenhower gets elected. Eisenhower gets elected in 1952. He actually does a decent job on civil rights. So there was one knock on him that I'll talk about. One of the things was he made sure the military actually was desegregated. A lot of the generals in the military and things of that nature kind of dragging their feet. He made sure that happened. He also sent troops to Little Rock, Arkansas to make sure the school desegregation order took place. And also he created or helped pass the Civil Rights Act of 1957, although there were some issues with that where it got gutted by Lyndon Johnson. We'll talk about that in another video. But the bottom line is those are some of the things that he did. So now he's trying to kind of bring back the Republican Party to some extent. He realizes what they had done in the past, and he's trying to bring it back. But I told you something there. Civil Rights Act of 1957, understand. It basically dealt with contempt orders and from a judge and whether he'd be tried by a jury or a judge. But the bottom line, it was a civil rights bill. But guess who was the majority party in the Senate and in the House? In the House, the Speaker of the House was Sam Rayburn, Democrat. In the Senate Majority Leader was Lyndon Johnson, Democrat. If you know anything about politics at all, you realize that nothing gets done unless the majority is in favor of it. Whether you're talking about in Congress, whether you're talking about in the Gold Dome, whether you're talking about at your local level, if the majority don't want it to happen, it's not going to happen. And so therefore, understand what's going on here. Democrat congressmen and senators, those African Americans who have moved up to the Northeast, Midwest, they're going back home and they're saying what? They're saying, yeah, Eisenhower, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 57. It was the Democratic Party that passed it. Yes, and don't forget Roosevelt's record and don't forget Truman's record. And so the African Americans who are participating up in those particular areas, they're saying, yeah, Roosevelt had a decent record, Truman had a decent record, and you're exactly right. Nothing passes unless you guys, as the Democratic Party, is actually going to allow it to pass. And so now you see the trend even going further towards the Democratic Party. Not because persons are just taking a chance or just saying what they got to lose, but based on real world situations. Thank you for watching. This particular video is one part of a 4-part series. If you would like to learn more about this subject, please watch the remaining 3 parts, or you can watch in its entirety by clicking the link below. I'm Georgia State Senator Harold Jones, and please be sure to like,